The harsh November wind whipped around the corners of our suburban house, mirroring the storm brewing inside me. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special about it, or so I thought. Sarah, my wife of 32 years, stood by the kitchen island, her arms crossed, her expression a familiar blend of frustration and something I couldn't quite decipher, disdain, perhaps. We were discussing our finances, a conversation that had become as regular and unpleasant as a root canal. "Honestly, Arthur," she began, her voice tight, "I just don't see how we're going to make this work. The bills keep piling up, and your ventures aren't exactly bringing in the kind of money we need." I bristled. My ventures, as she so dismissively called them, were my attempts to recapture a spark, a sense of purpose that had been slowly eroding with each passing year. I'd always been a man of ambition, of drive, or at least I used to be. "What do you mean, Sarah?" "I'm doing my best," I countered, my voice a little louder than I intended. She sighed, a sound that grated on my nerves. "Your best, Arthur? Your best is barely treading water. Look at David. He's always got something new going on, always successful. He's twice the man you are, Arthur. He knows how to make things happen." The words hit me like a physical blow. David, my oldest friend, the golden boy of our social circle, the man whose shadow I'd always felt lurking, even when he wasn't around. Sarah's comparison wasn't new, not really. She'd always held him up as an example, a yardstick against which I constantly fell short. But hearing it so bluntly, so cruelly, in the context of my own perceived failures, it was too much. My vision tunneled. The familiar room, the comfortable chairs, the photographs of our children on the mantelpiece, it all seemed to swim before my eyes. Twice the man I am. The insult wasn't just about David. It was about me, about my entire life, about everything I had or hadn't accomplished. It was about Sarah's deep-seated disappointment in me. A cold resolve settled in my gut. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something harder, colder, a decision. If my own wife saw me as so inadequate, so inferior to my best friend, then perhaps she didn't deserve what was mine. Not anymore. The house, the savings, the future we had planned. If she thought I was half the man, then she wouldn't get even half of what I had. "You think David is twice the man I am, Sarah?" I asked, my voice unnervingly calm. I walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. The wind outside howled, a fitting soundtrack to the turmoil that had just erupted within me. She hesitated, perhaps sensing a shift in the atmosphere, a hardening in my gaze. "Arthur, I just mean—" "No," I interrupted, my voice cutting through her attempt at damage control. "You said it. You truly believe David is twice the man I am." Her eyes darted away, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "It's not that simple." "It is that simple," I stated, the words echoing in the sudden silence. "And if that's how you see me, then you've made your choice, and I've just made mine." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, bathed in the sterile glow of the overhead lights. The storm outside raged on, but the tempest within me had found its direction. I wasn't going to be the man who was compared unfavorably to his best friend anymore, and she, Sarah, the one who had delivered that damning verdict, would not profit from my perceived shortcomings. She wouldn't keep a dime of mine. David. Even his name felt like a betrayal. We'd grown up together, shared scraped knees, first crushes, and dreams whispered under starry skies. He was the effortlessly charming one, the natural leader, the one who always seemed to have the answers, and more importantly, the success. While I was meticulously planning my next move, David was already 5 steps ahead, usually with a confident grin and a handshake that sealed a deal. Our families had been close, our mothers gossiping over coffee while we boys built forts in the woods behind our houses. There was an unspoken expectation that we would always be friends, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of childhood. And for a long time, we were. I admired David, I truly did. He had a charisma that drew people in, a drive that was infectious. But somewhere along the way, admiration had curdled into envy, a quiet, gnawing resentment that I tried my best to keep hidden. Sarah's words had merely ripped away the thin veil of my denial. She saw what I often tried to ignore, the stark contrast between David's seemingly effortless ascent and my own more arduous journey. David had founded a tech startup that had taken off like a rocket. He was on magazine covers, gave TED Talks, and his face was plastered on billboards across the city. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the American dream. My own career had been solid, dependable, but never spectacular. I'd worked my way up in a reputable accounting firm, eventually becoming a partner. It was a good life, a secure life. We had a nice house, 2 successful children, and a comfortable retirement fund. But comfort, it seemed, was not Sarah's definition of success. She craved the spotlight, the dazzle, the tangible proof of extraordinary achievement. And David, with his overflowing bank accounts and public accolades, was her shining example. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, the cold space between Sarah and me a tangible barrier. I replayed her words, dissecting them, amplifying them. Twice the man you are. It wasn't just about career. It was about everything. My confidence, my assertiveness, my very masculinity. It was a profound indictment of my entire existence. I thought about the small things, the everyday interactions. How Sarah would always defer to David's opinions on investments, even though I was the financial expert in our household. How she'd light up when David entered a room, her conversation instantly becoming more animated. How she'd subtly steer our children towards David's children, hoping, I now realized, for some transference of his Midas touch. The realization was a bitter pill. Sarah hadn't just been comparing me to David. She had been using him to highlight my perceived inadequacies for years, and I, in my naive desire for peace and marital harmony, had allowed it. I had swallowed my pride, bitten my tongue, and endured the subtle jabs, the pointed questions, the well-intentioned but damning advice, but no more. The words, "She wouldn't keep a dime of mine," weren't just a threat. They were a declaration of independence. If Sarah valued David's supposed prowess over my own achievements, then she would learn the true meaning of value, and perhaps consequence. I needed to disentangle myself from this suffocating narrative, to reclaim my own worth, and if that meant dismantling the comfortable life we had built, so be it. The next morning I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The decision was made. It was a drastic one, a painful one, but it felt utterly necessary. I would begin to secure my assets. I would ensure that Sarah's harsh assessment of my worth would have tangible and perhaps deeply regrettable financial implications for her. The game had changed. The days following Sarah's pronouncement were a strange mixture of simmering resolve and an almost detached calm. I went through the motions of my daily life, the commute to my office, the meetings, the spreadsheets. But beneath the surface, a meticulous plan was taking shape. The insult had ignited a fire, but it was a controlled burn, fueled by logic and a deep-seated desire for justice, or perhaps vindication. My first step was purely informational. I needed to understand the full extent of our financial entanglement. For years, Sarah had managed the household budget, while I handled our investments and major financial decisions. It was a system that had worked, or at least seemed to work, until now. I began subtly reviewing our joint accounts, our investment portfolios, the details of our property deeds. It was a painstaking process, requiring a level of discretion I hadn't anticipated. I didn't want to raise immediate suspicion, not yet. I started by making copies of important financial documents, stashing them in a secure location outside the house. Birth certificates, marriage certificates, property titles, bank statements, investment portfolio reports. Everything that documented what was mine, or what we had built together. The irony wasn't lost on me. The accountant was meticulously auditing his own life, preparing for a financial separation. The words "twice the man" echoed in my mind, not as a source of pain anymore, but as a propellant. If I was truly so inadequate, why should my hard-earned assets be so readily accessible to someone who saw me in that light? It felt like a gross imbalance, a fundamental injustice. David, with his apparent success, wouldn't tolerate such a situation, would he? I also began to research legal avenues. I discreetly consulted with a lawyer, a discreet man I'd known for years through business dealings. I explained the situation in broad strokes, emphasizing the breakdown of communication and mutual respect in my marriage. I didn't mention David directly, not at first. I didn't want to sound like a petty, jealous husband. But the core of the issue was clear. Sarah's devaluation of me had led to a fundamental shift in my perspective regarding our shared future. "Arthur," the lawyer, a sharp woman named Eleanor Vance, said after I'd laid out the basics, "this sounds like a potential divorce, and based on what you're saying, a contentious one. You need to be prepared for a lengthy and potentially costly process. Are you sure this is the direction you want to go?" "I'm sure, Eleanor," I replied, my voice firm. She made her opinion of me very clear. "I'm not going to live the rest of my life feeling like a second-class citizen in my own home, especially when it comes to the financial future we've built." Eleanor nodded, her expression professional but understanding. "All right. In that case, the first and most crucial step is to secure your assets. We need to understand what is considered marital property and what might be your separate property. We also need to ensure that any assets you wish to protect are not dissipated before any legal proceedings begin." This was it, the point of no return. The decision to protect what was mine, to ensure Sarah wouldn't benefit from her disparaging remarks, had moved from a raw emotional reaction to a concrete strategic action. I felt a strange sense of liberation, a shedding of a burden I hadn't even realized I was carrying for so long. Over the next few weeks, I began to make subtle yet significant changes. I opened a new separate bank account, transferring a portion of my salary into it. I began exploring options for separating some of our joint investments, always careful to tread the legal line, ensuring I wasn't engaging in any act that could be construed as fraud. It was a delicate dance, a balancing act between protecting myself and avoiding any actions that could backfire legally or emotionally. I even started taking longer walks, exploring different parts of the city, breathing in the crisp autumn air. It was a physical manifestation of my mental journey, distancing myself, gaining perspective, and with every step, the resolve hardened. She thought I was half the man? Fine. She wouldn't get the full measure of what that half had worked for. The atmosphere at home had become taut. Sarah, bless her heart, seemed oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred within me. She continued with her routine, her conversations often circling back to her usual themes: the rising cost of living, the need for more savings, and, inevitably, subtle comparisons to David's latest triumphs. "Did you see the news about David's new venture?" she'd say, her eyes bright with vicarious excitement. "He's really changing the world, Arthur. It's inspiring." I'd offer a non-committal grunt or a brief nod, my mind occupied with the intricate legal and financial maneuvers I was undertaking. The emotional distance between us had widened into a chasm, and I knew she felt it, but she attributed it to my moodiness, my stress from work, perhaps even a midlife crisis. She couldn't fathom that her own words, the casual cruelty of them, had been the catalyst for this profound change. My lawyer, Eleanor, was instrumental in guiding me. She explained the complexities of asset division in a potential divorce, emphasizing the importance of documentation and strategic planning. "Separate property," she'd explained, "is what you owned before the marriage, or received during the marriage as a gift or inheritance. Marital property, on the other hand, is generally everything acquired by either spouse during the marriage. Your goal is to demonstrate as clearly as possible what rightfully belongs to you and what was acquired through your individual efforts and foresight." This distinction became my mantra. I started meticulously documenting every financial decision I'd made over the years, tracing the origins of our various investments. I created spreadsheets detailing my contributions to retirement funds, the down payment on the house, even the initial capital for some of our early, less successful ventures, the ones Sarah always dismissed. The emotional detachment I was cultivating also extended to our interactions. I found myself observing her with a new, almost clinical eye. Her complaints about money, which used to sting, now seemed performative. Was she genuinely worried, or was this a long-standing tactic to make me feel inadequate, to keep me striving, to keep me financially responsible for her comfort? The thought was unsettling, but also liberating. One evening, while Sarah was out at a book club meeting, I took the opportunity to delve deeper into our shared digital life. I accessed our joint financial planning software, meticulously downloading statements and reports onto a secure USB drive. It felt invasive, a breach of trust, but my resolve was unwavering. This was no longer about marital harmony. It was about self-preservation. As I worked, I came across an old digital photo album, images of our wedding day, our children as toddlers, family vacations, memories that once filled me with warmth now felt tinged with a bittersweet melancholy. Had I been so blind, so caught up in the illusion of a happy marriage, that I hadn't seen the cracks forming beneath the surface? I remembered a particular argument years ago about a potential investment opportunity I'd wanted to pursue. Sarah had been vehemently against it, citing the risk. David would never be so reckless, she'd said then, planting the seed of doubt that ultimately led me to abandon the idea. That venture, had I pursued it, would have likely yielded significant returns. Now, those missed opportunities felt like personal losses, amplified by Sarah's constant reinforcement of David's success. The financial maneuvering was a complex, often tedious undertaking. It required focus, patience, and a certain ruthlessness that I was surprised to find within myself. But each step, each secured document, each carefully worded email to Eleanor strengthened my conviction. I was no longer the man who passively accepted his wife's dismissive comparisons. I was Arthur, the man who had built a life, who deserved respect, and who would not allow his legacy to be devalued, or worse, taken advantage of. The world outside continued its usual rhythm. Leaves fell, the days grew shorter, and the cold of approaching winter settled in. But within the walls of our home, a silent internal transformation was well underway, a shift that would soon make its presence felt in undeniable ways. The name David, once a simple marker of childhood friendship, had mutated into something far more potent, a symbol of everything I was perceived to lack. Sarah's constant invocation of him, whether direct or implied, had created a subtle but pervasive atmosphere in our home. It was a silent pressure, a constant reminder of a benchmark I apparently failed to meet. I started noticing little things. When discussing potential purchases, Sarah would often preface her opinion with, "David would probably say this is a good deal." Or when I proposed a family outing, she might muse, "David and his family always seem to have such wonderful adventures." These weren't malicious remarks, not overtly, but they were undeniably pointed. They were designed to highlight my perceived shortcomings by contrasting them with David's supposed perfections. The irony was that David, despite his outward success, was not without his own complexities. I knew this because, despite the growing chasm between us, we still spoke occasionally. Our conversations were polite, surface level, but sometimes in moments of unexpected candor, he'd hint at the pressures of maintaining his image, the relentless demands of his business, the loneliness that often accompanied such public visibility. He even confessed once that he sometimes envied the quiet stability of my life. But Sarah, blinded by the glitter of his public persona, never saw those nuances. To her, David was an unassailable icon of success, a man who effortlessly navigated the complexities of life and wealth, and I, Arthur, was the steady, dependable, but ultimately unremarkable accountant. This persistent comparison had begun to chip away at my confidence, and Sarah's words had been the final blow. Now, as I meticulously worked to secure my financial future, I found myself actively avoiding any mention of David. When Sarah brought him up, I'd offer a terse response or feign a lack of interest. It was a passive resistance, a small act of rebellion against the narrative she had so carefully constructed. My lawyer, Eleanor, advised caution. Any sudden drastic changes to your financial behavior could be seen as an attempt to hide assets, she warned. We need to be methodical, transparent within the bounds of our strategy, and above all, legal. The goal is to protect what is yours, not to create grounds for Sarah to accuse you of financial misconduct. Her words were a stark reminder of the tightrope I was walking. I continued my routine at the office, but my mind was constantly buzzing with calculations and strategies. I started setting aside a portion of my bonus, a significant chunk of it, into a separate account that Sarah had no knowledge of. It felt like a secret operation, a clandestine war waged on paper and through hushed phone calls. I also began to reevaluate our shared assets. The house, for instance. It was a beautiful home, a testament to years of hard work. But was it a home I truly felt a part of anymore? Or was it merely a symbol of a life I was now beginning to dismantle? I started discreetly researching property valuations, exploring the feasibility of a buyout or a sale. The emotional toll was undeniable. There were moments of doubt, flashes of guilt. Was I being too harsh, too impulsive? But then I'd recall Sarah's words, the cold finality with which she dismissed my worth, and my resolve would firm again. She had set the terms of engagement, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The whispers of David, both literal and figurative, were the constant soundtrack to my inner turmoil, but for the first time, I was determined not to be silenced by them. I was Arthur, and my story, my financial reality, would no longer be dictated by comparisons to anyone, least of all my wife's idealized version of my best friend. The preparation was almost complete. Soon, the real action would begin. The term paper trail had taken on a whole new meaning for me. It was no longer just about financial records. It was about constructing a narrative, a meticulously documented account of my life's work, my contributions, my value. Sarah's casual dismissal had ignited a fierce determination to prove her wrong, not through grand gestures or public pronouncements, but through the cold, hard facts laid out in black and white. Eleanor, my lawyer, had emphasized the importance of proving my case. In any financial separation, Arthur, she'd explained, it boils down to what you can prove. The more documentation you have, the stronger your position. We need to show not just what you earned, but how you earned it, how you managed it, and how it contributed to the marital estate. So I became a detective in my own life. I dug through old filing cabinets, unearthed boxes of forgotten documents from the attic, and scoured digital archives. I reconstructed the history of our finances, tracing the journey of every dollar, every investment, every decision. I started with our early years, the small apartment, the scrimping and saving, the sacrifices we'd made together. I documented the initial contributions to our first savings account, the down payment on our first modest home. I highlighted my role in managing those early finances, my cautious approach that laid the groundwork for future stability. Then came the bigger investments. The stock market ups and downs, the property ventures, the retirement funds. I meticulously logged my research, my due diligence, the hours I spent analyzing market trends and economic forecasts. I even recalled specific instances where I had resisted Sarah's more impulsive spending suggestions, arguments that had felt trivial at the time, but now represented my commitment to long-term financial security. I also focused on proving the existence of my separate property, gifts from my parents, an inheritance from my aunt. These were assets that predated our marriage or came to me independently. I gathered bank statements, legal documents, and witness testimonies from distant relatives who could corroborate the details to support these claims. The process was emotionally taxing. It forced me to confront the reality of our marriage, the subtle ways in which my contributions had been overlooked or undervalued. I remembered Sarah's frequent requests for funds for her various hobbies and social endeavors, often framed as necessities for maintaining our social standing. I had always obliged, wanting to keep her happy, but now I saw those expenditures in a different light, as potential drains on assets that could have been more strategically managed. The contrast with David was still a painful undercurrent. I knew he was successful, but I also knew that his wealth was built on a different foundation, a high-risk, high-reward tech startup. My own financial journey had been one of calculated risk, steady growth, and diligent management. It was a different kind of success, perhaps less flashy but no less valid, and Sarah's dismissal of it, her insistence that David was twice the man, felt like a profound betrayal of my life's work. Eleanor's guidance was invaluable. She helped me organize the deluge of information into a coherent and compelling narrative. She advised on how to present evidence, how to anticipate Sarah's counterarguments, and how to navigate the legal complexities of asset division. "We need to build an irrefutable case, Arthur," she'd said. "The more evidence we have, the stronger our negotiating position will be, and the less likely it is that Sarah will be able to claim a disproportionate share of what is rightfully yours." As I pieced together this elaborate paper trail, a sense of vindication began to replace the initial hurt. It wasn't just about protecting my finances anymore. It was about reclaiming my narrative, about asserting my worth in a way that Sarah could no longer ignore. The cold, hard facts laid out in organized folders and digital files were my ammunition, and I was ready to deploy them. The decision to open a separate bank account had been one of the first tangible steps I'd taken after Sarah's damning words. It was a calculated move, designed to create a financial buffer, a sanctuary for funds that I wanted to keep entirely separate from her purview. Now, as I diligently funneled a significant portion of my income into this new account, I felt a sense of quiet control I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't about secrecy in a nefarious sense. It was about strategic segregation. Sarah's pronouncement had fundamentally altered my perception of our shared financial future. If she viewed me as less capable, less valuable, then she didn't deserve access to the resources I had painstakingly accumulated and managed. This separate account was the physical manifestation of that decision. Eleanor, my lawyer, had cautioned me about the legal implications. It's crucial, Arthur, that any funds transferred to this separate account can be clearly traced back to your individual earnings or separate property. Commingling funds, mixing your separate money with marital assets, can complicate things significantly and could be seen as an attempt to hide assets. We need to maintain a clear distinction. Adhering to her advice, I ensured that all deposits into the new account came directly from my salary or from the sale of assets that I could prove were my separate property. I meticulously documented each transaction, creating a clear audit trail that would stand up to legal scrutiny. The account itself was unassuming, a standard checking account opened at a different branch than our usual bank, in a different town even, to minimize the chances of Sarah stumbling upon it. I chose a bank with a reputation for discretion and efficiency. The act of depositing money into this account, money that would have otherwise gone into our joint accounts or been subject to Sarah's financial oversight, felt empowering. It was like building a fortress brick by brick around my financial future. Each deposit was a statement. I am taking control. I am protecting what is mine. This financial separation also began to influence my interactions with Sarah. I became more circumspect about discussing our finances. When she'd ask about specific investments or savings goals, I'd offer vague answers or defer the conversation. I'm handling it, I'd say, or it's all under control. These responses, while truthful, created a subtle distance, a lack of transparency that I knew would eventually lead to questions. One evening, Sarah casually mentioned a planned renovation for the kitchen. I was thinking we could finally update the countertops, she said, her eyes gleaming with anticipation, and maybe get that new professional-grade stove we've talked about. Normally, I would have engaged in the discussion, perhaps suggesting compromises or budget adjustments, but now my mind immediately went to the funds in my separate account. Let's put a pin in that for now, Sarah, I replied, my tone neutral. I want to review our overall financial picture before making any major commitments. Her brow furrowed slightly. But Arthur, it's just a renovation. We can afford it. Can we? I countered, a hint of challenge in my voice. Let's make sure before we commit. It wasn't about denying her the renovation outright. It was about reclaiming the decision-making power. It was about showing her that I was no longer the pliable husband who readily agreed to every suggestion. The separate account was more than just a financial tool. It was a symbol of my renewed autonomy, a tangible representation of my decision to no longer be diminished. As the funds in the separate account grew, so did my confidence. I knew the legal battle ahead would be challenging, but with this secure financial base, I felt more prepared than ever to face it. Sarah had made her assessment of my worth. Now, I was making mine, and it was a value she would soon be forced to acknowledge. Eleanor Vance's office was a sanctuary of calm, a stark contrast to the emotional storm brewing in my personal life. The room was tastefully decorated, filled with the scent of old paper and polished wood, a testament to her grounded professionalism. She was a woman who exuded quiet competence, her sharp intellect masked by a gentle demeanor. "Arthur," she began, gesturing for me to take a seat, "we've gathered a significant amount of documentation. Your financial history is remarkably well organized given the circumstances." I offered a small, weary smile. Years of being an accountant, I suppose, or perhaps a subconscious preparation for this very moment. She returned the smile, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Indeed. Now, about Sarah's reaction. Have you noticed any change in her behavior since you started implementing these precautionary measures?" "She's certainly become more inquisitive," I admitted. "She senses something is different, but she can't quite put her finger on it. She attributes it to stress, I think, or maybe she's just hoping I'll snap out of this mood." Eleanor nodded. "That's precisely what we want. We need to avoid any overt actions that could be construed as aggressive or retaliatory. Our strategy is about protection and preparation, not provocation." She then laid out the next phase of our plan. We need to begin formalizing the separation of assets. This will involve sending out formal notices, requesting financial disclosures from Sarah, and potentially engaging in mediation or, if necessary, initiating divorce proceedings. The word divorce hung in the air, heavy and final. It was a reality I had intellectually accepted, but hearing it spoken aloud by Eleanor made it chillingly real. "What is the likelihood, Eleanor," I asked, my voice low, "that she will try to fight for a disproportionate share? Given her opinions on my capabilities?" Eleanor leaned forward. "It's a valid concern. Her statements about David, while not legally binding, could be used by her legal team to paint a picture of you as less successful, less capable. We need to counter that narrative with concrete evidence of your contributions, your foresight, and the value you've brought to the marriage. Your meticulous record-keeping is our strongest asset here." She then explained the concept of marital debt. "Just as assets are divided, so are debts incurred during the marriage. We need to ensure that any financial liabilities are also assessed fairly. Your separate account, the funds you've meticulously segregated, will be crucial in demonstrating that you have acted responsibly to protect your individual assets." We spent the next hour poring over spreadsheets, discussing legal strategies, and anticipating Sarah's potential arguments. Eleanor advised me on how to handle direct conversations about finances, urging me to remain calm, factual, and avoid emotional outbursts. "Let the documents speak for themselves, Arthur," she said. "Your goal is to present a clear, unassailable case for a fair division." As I left Eleanor's office, the weight of the situation settled upon me more heavily than ever. This wasn't just a financial dispute. It was the unraveling of a life, the dismantling of a family. But beneath the sadness, a steely resolve hardened. Sarah had delivered a verdict on my worth. Now, through the deliberate and calculated process guided by Eleanor, I was going to ensure that verdict had consequences, not just for her perception, but for her tangible reality. The legal framework was being built, and it was being built to protect me. The tension in the house was palpable, a silent hum beneath the veneer of normalcy. Sarah hadn't confronted me directly about the changes she undoubtedly sensed, but her behavior had become subtly more probing. She'd ask pointed questions about my whereabouts, my phone calls, my late nights at the office. Her curiosity was laced with an edge of suspicion, a dawning realization that something was amiss. One evening she found an unopened statement from a financial institution I rarely used, a bank where my separate account was held. She held it up, her expression a mixture of confusion and accusation. "Arthur, what is this? I don't recognize this bank." I took a deep breath, channeling Eleanor's advice to remain calm and factual. "It's a personal account, Sarah. Just some old investments I'm consolidating." "Consolidating into a new bank without telling me?" Her voice rose, the frustration evident. "What are you hiding, Arthur?" "I'm not hiding anything," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm simply reorganizing my personal financial affairs. As you know, I've always handled the investments. But we're a team, Arthur. We're supposed to make these decisions together." Her voice cracked, the emotion finally breaking through. Unless you don't see me as part of the team anymore." This was it, the opening, the moment where I could either retreat into old patterns or stand firm. I chose to stand firm. "Sarah," I said, my voice softer but no less resolute, "for years I've felt like I've been carrying the weight of our financial future alone, while you've been preoccupied with other things. And lately, honestly, your comments about my capabilities, about how David is twice the man I am, have made me question a lot of things, including how much I want to continue sharing my financial life with someone who clearly values my contributions so little." Her eyes widened, caught off guard by my directness. She had expected defensiveness, perhaps anger, but not this calm, reasoned assertion. I didn't mean it like that, Arthur," she stammered, her bravado faltering. "I was just frustrated." "Frustrated enough to devalue my entire life's work?" I countered, the hurt still present, but no longer controlling me. "Sarah, I've spent decades building our financial security. I've made difficult decisions, taken calculated risks, and managed our assets diligently, and your response has often been to compare me unfavorably to David. That's not frustration, that's disrespect." The conversation hung heavy in the air. The unopened bank statement lay on the coffee table, a silent witness to the unraveling trust. I could see the gears turning in her mind, the dawning realization that the comfortable status quo was irrevocably shifting. My actions, the separate account, the discreet research, the conversations with Eleanor, were subtle provocations, designed not to hurt, but to awaken her to the reality of my feelings and my intentions. I wasn't lashing out. I was asserting my boundaries, reclaiming my sense of self-worth. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the floor. "So, what are you saying, Arthur?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm saying that things need to change, Sarah," I replied. "And that change starts with acknowledging the value of what I bring to the table. And if that acknowledgement isn't possible, then we need to find a way to separate our lives, financially and otherwise, in a way that is fair and respectful. Respectful of my contributions and respectful of my worth." The storm had broken, not with a dramatic explosion, but with the quiet, steady drip of truth. The paper trail was leading us all in a new direction, and the consequences of Sarah's words were finally beginning to unfold. The weight of Sarah's words, "Your friend was twice the man you are," had settled deep within me, morphing from a sting of humiliation into a hard, unyielding resolve. It wasn't just about David anymore. It was about the insidious nature of comparison, the way it could erode self-worth and poison relationships. And I was determined that Sarah would learn the true cost of such comparisons, not just to me, but to the life they had built together. My clandestine financial maneuvers were proceeding with Eleanor's steady guidance. The separate account was growing, a silent testament to my independent financial strategy. I was meticulously documenting every asset, every potential liability, ensuring that when the time came for formal division, my position would be unassailable. But the emotional aspect of this impending separation was equally significant. I found myself observing Sarah with a detached curiosity, analyzing her behavior, her motivations. Was her constant invocation of David a genuine reflection of her values, or a manipulative tactic to keep me striving, to keep me feeling inadequate and therefore more compliant? One afternoon, while sorting through old family photos, I stumbled upon a collection from our early years. There we were, young and hopeful, standing beside David and his then-girlfriend, all of us laughing, full of dreams. In those photos there was no discernible difference in our standing, no hint of the resentment that would later fester. It was a poignant reminder of how much things had changed, and how much of that change stemmed from Sarah's evolving perspective. Eleanor's counsel was invaluable in navigating this emotional minefield. "It's important to remember why you're doing this, Arthur," she'd said during one of our consultations. "It's not about revenge. It's about establishing your worth, ensuring you are treated with the respect you deserve, and securing your financial future. Don't let the emotional complexity derail your strategic objectives." Her words were a grounding force. I had to compartmentalize, to separate the hurt from the strategy. The financial preparations were the tangible expression of my decision, but they were also a means to an end, to force Sarah to confront the consequences of her dismissive attitude. I began to consider the tangible costs of this impending separation. The house, the investments, the lifestyle we had cultivated, all of it would be subject to division. And if Sarah believed I was so inadequate, so lacking in value, then she would soon discover the significant financial implications of divorcing a man she perceived as half the man he should be. The thought brought a grim satisfaction. It wasn't about inflicting pain, but about establishing a clear, undeniable reality. Her dismissive words had consequences, and those consequences would be measured in dollars and cents. One evening, Sarah made a comment about needing a new car. "Mine's getting old, Arthur," she said almost casually. "I was thinking something like David's new SUV. He says they're incredibly reliable." Instead of the usual acquiescence, I offered a measured response. "We'll have to see what makes financial sense, Sarah. I'm not making any major purchases until we have a clearer picture of our financial situation moving forward." Her eyes narrowed, a flash of anger in them. "Are you saying we can't afford it?" "I'm saying we need to be prudent," I replied, holding her gaze, "especially now." The cost of comparison was becoming evident, not just in the emotional toll it had taken on me, but in the tangible reshaping of our shared future. Sarah had devalued me. Now she would face the financial reality of separating from the man whose worth she had so carelessly dismissed. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than she could have imagined. The air in our house had grown thick with unspoken truths. Sarah and I moved around each other like strangers, our conversations stilted, our interactions carefully choreographed to avoid any direct confrontation. Yet, beneath the surface, a storm of emotions brewed. Resentment, hurt, confusion, and a dawning fear on Sarah's part, I suspected. My legal preparations continued apace, Eleanor had advised me to gather all relevant financial documents, not just for my own records, but to present a comprehensive picture to Sarah's legal team, should it come to that. I spent hours in my study, meticulously organizing bank statements, investment portfolios, tax returns, and property deeds. Each document was a piece of evidence, a testament to my diligence and contribution. The narrative Sarah had woven, the one that placed David on a pedestal and me in the shadows, was being systematically dismantled, not with angry words, but with irrefutable facts. I focused on demonstrating the growth of our assets, the prudent management of our finances, and the consistent effort I had invested over the years. One evening, Sarah broached the subject of our children's futures. "Their college funds are doing well, aren't they, Arthur?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of anxiety. "We need to make sure they're taken care of." "The funds are on track," I confirmed, my tone even. "I've been managing them carefully." She hesitated, then added, "David's children are at some very prestigious universities. He's always been so good at planning for their education." The familiar barb. It was almost automatic now, a reflex response from Sarah. But this time, instead of feeling diminished, I felt a surge of quiet confidence. "My planning ensures their education is secure, Sarah," I stated firmly, "and it does so without the kind of speculative risks that David often takes. Our children will have a solid foundation, regardless of who is lauded for their financial acumen." Her silence was more telling than any response. She knew I was right. My approach, though less flashy than David's, was reliable and effective. Eleanor had also advised me to start thinking about the division of other assets, not just financial ones. "The house, the cars, any joint property," she'd said. "We need to assess their value and determine a fair division. Given Sarah's apparent dissatisfaction with your perceived financial standing, she might be more inclined to seek a larger share of the marital estate. We need to be prepared for that." This meant discreetly obtaining appraisals for the house and vehicles. It meant considering my long-term needs and preferences. Was I going to stay in the house? Would I want to buy out her share? These were complex questions, but for the first time, they were questions I was asking myself, not out of obligation, but out of a newfound sense of personal agency. The unspoken truths were becoming louder, more insistent. Sarah's passive-aggressive comparisons, my quiet financial preparations, the looming spectre of legal proceedings, it was all part of a larger narrative of disillusionment and reassessment. I was no longer willing to live under the shadow of David's perceived superiority, nor was I willing to accept Sarah's diminished view of my worth. The truth, however painful, was beginning to emerge, and it was a truth that would fundamentally reshape our lives. The formal notice arrived on a crisp autumn morning, tucked neatly into the mailbox alongside junk mail and utility bills. It was from Eleanor Vance's law firm, addressed to Sarah. Seeing it, cold and official, made the abstract concept of separation terrifyingly real. This was no longer just my internal resolve. This was the legal machinery grinding into motion. I watched Sarah's reaction as she opened it, her face draining of color as she read the contents. The carefully constructed calm she had maintained for weeks shattered. Her hands trembled, and a small choked gasp escaped her lips. "Arthur, what is this?" Her voice was barely a whisper, laced with a fear that was almost palpable. I met her gaze, my own expression one of somber resolve. "It's what we've been heading towards, Sarah. A formal separation, a discussion about how we move forward." "But divorce? You're really doing this?" Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. "After all these years?" "Sarah," I said, my voice softer now, tinged with the sadness of what we had lost. "You made your feelings about me quite clear. You compared me unfavorably to David, questioning my worth, my capabilities. I cannot continue to live in a marriage where I am constantly made to feel inadequate. My actions, including this legal notice, are a consequence of that." She sank onto the sofa, the notice clutched in her hand. I didn't mean it, Arthur. Not really. It was just words. "Words have power, Sarah," I replied, and those words had a profound impact on me. They made me realize that the foundation of respect, which is essential in any partnership, was eroding, and I needed to protect myself, financially and emotionally. Eleanor had advised me to be direct but not accusatory, to present the legal step as a necessary process, not an act of aggression, and that's what I was trying to do. "So, what happens now?" she asked, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Eleanor will be handling the legal aspects," I explained. "She will be in contact with your legal representation, should you choose to obtain one. This notice is simply the first formal step in initiating discussions about asset division, spousal support, and other relevant matters." The mention of legal representation seemed to jolt her. The reality of a potentially costly and complex legal battle began to sink in. Her previous casual comparisons to David's success now seemed like a naive underestimation of the consequences. "David, what will David think?" she murmured, more to herself than to me. I couldn't help but feel a pang of something akin to pity. Her reliance on external validation, on comparing herself and her life to others, had blinded her to the damage she was inflicting. "This is about us, Sarah," I said, the finality in my voice undeniable. "About our marriage, our lives, and the choices we've made. What David thinks is no longer our primary concern." The formal notice was out. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges, but it was a path I had chosen. The decision to protect my assets, to assert my worth, was no longer a private resolve. It was a public legal declaration. And Sarah, who had once dismissed me as half the man, would soon have to face the tangible, legal, and financial realities of a separation initiated by the man she had so carelessly undervalued. The request for financial disclosure was a pivotal moment. It transformed the quiet internal machinations into a formal adversarial process. Sarah, now represented by a lawyer recommended by a friend, likely not David, I hoped, had submitted her response, and it was, as Eleanor had predicted, ambitious. Her legal team, armed with Sarah's interpretations and resentments, had laid out a claim for a significant portion of our assets, including a substantial portion of funds that I considered my separate property. They cited my lack of engagement in certain joint financial decisions, and predictably alluded to my perceived financial shortcomings, implicitly contrasting them with David's supposed financial prowess. "It's audacious, Arthur," Eleanor stated, reviewing the documents in her office. "They're trying to paint you as a passive participant, someone who let finances slide, while Sarah was the one managing the household and trying to keep things afloat. And they're using David as their benchmark for what a successful husband should be." I felt a wave of indignation, quickly suppressed. This was precisely what Eleanor had warned me about. "So the twice the man comment is being weaponized," I observed dryly. "Indeed," Eleanor confirmed, "but we have our own arsenal. Your meticulous records, the documentation of your separate property, the clear audit trail of your separate account, these are our defenses. We need to systematically dismantle their claims point by point." The process of responding to Sarah's disclosure was painstaking. We had to provide detailed explanations for every asset, every transaction, every investment decision. It required revisiting every piece of paper, every digital file I had painstakingly gathered. I recall one particular point of contention: the initial capital I had invested in a small speculative venture years ago. It had ultimately failed, a fact Sarah had never let me forget. Her lawyers were attempting to use this past failure to argue that I was a poor financial decision-maker. "We counter this by highlighting your subsequent successes," Eleanor explained. "We show how you learned from that failure, how you adapted your strategy, and how over the long term you built a substantial estate for the family. We also need to emphasize that this was a single instance, while your consistent, prudent management of our core assets is the defining characteristic of your financial behavior." The back and forth was draining. Each day brought new challenges, new arguments to refute. Sarah, I learned through Eleanor, was increasingly anxious. The reality of losing financial security, the prospect of a messy, public legal battle, was clearly taking its toll. She had perhaps underestimated the resolve of the man she had dismissed. The separate account, the one I had established so cautiously, now played a crucial role. It demonstrated my foresight and my intention to maintain financial independence, not out of malice but out of necessity. It showed that I had acted responsibly, anticipating potential future needs, a stark contrast to the image her lawyers were trying to project. This stage of the legal process was a grim reminder of the true cost of broken trust and devalued worth. Sarah had wanted David's validation. Now she was facing the cold, hard reality of confronting the man she had underestimated, armed with the very evidence of his competence she had once dismissed. The disclosures were out, and the fight for fair division had truly begun. The legal proceedings had reached a stalemate. Both sides had presented their cases, their arguments meticulously laid out by Eleanor and Sarah's lawyer. The exchanges were formal, procedural, and deeply unsettling. The emotional core of our marital breakdown, the brutal honesty of Sarah's initial pronouncement, was now buried under layers of legal jargon and financial minutiae. Eleanor advised me that Sarah was becoming increasingly distressed by the protracted nature of the proceedings. The financial strain, the emotional toll, and the uncertainty of the outcome were clearly weighing on her. She had made a few attempts to reach out directly, bypassing her lawyer, but I had politely declined, insisting that all communication go through our respective legal representatives. It was the only way to maintain objectivity and avoid further emotional entanglement. "She's feeling the pressure, Arthur," Eleanor reported after a particularly tense phone call with Sarah's attorney. "They're suggesting mediation, a private session with a neutral third party to try and reach an agreement outside of court." Mediation. The word conjured images of tense negotiations, forced compromises, and the potential for more emotional exhaustion. But it also offered a potential end to the draining legal battle. "What are your thoughts, Arthur?" Eleanor asked. "Are you willing to sit down with Sarah and try to resolve this amicably, with a mediator present?" I paused, considering. The initial fire of righteous indignation had long since cooled, replaced by a weary pragmatism. While I stood firm on the principle of fair division based on my contributions, the idea of dragging this out indefinitely felt pointless. Sarah had devalued me, yes, but the prospect of prolonging this conflict, of inflicting further damage, didn't hold the same appeal as it once had. "I am willing to try mediation, Eleanor," I said finally, "but I will not compromise on the principle of fair division. My contributions are well documented, and I expect them to be recognized." "That's the right approach," Eleanor assured me. "We will go into mediation prepared, with a clear understanding of our objectives and a firm grasp of the evidence. The mediator's role is to facilitate communication, not to dictate terms. We will present our case clearly and rationally." The day of the mediation arrived, grey and overcast, mirroring my mood. Sarah and I sat across from each other in a sterile conference room. The mediator, a calm, middle-aged woman, positioned between us. The silence was heavy, pregnant with years of unspoken resentments and a shared history that now felt like a burden. Sarah looked thinner, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. The confident woman who had once held David up as her ideal seemed a distant memory. She was just a woman, caught in the consequences of her own words and choices. The mediator began by outlining the process, emphasizing neutrality and the goal of reaching a mutually agreeable settlement. We then proceeded, with Eleanor and Sarah's lawyer flanking us, to discuss the division of assets. It was a slow, arduous process. We revisited the property, the investments, the retirement funds. There were moments of friction, brief flashes of the old arguments, but the mediator skillfully steered us back to the task at hand. As we delved deeper, it became clear that Sarah, despite her initial ambitious claims, was willing to concede on certain points. The financial reality of her legal strategy, coupled with the mounting pressure, had made her more pragmatic. She seemed to understand finally that my meticulous financial planning and documentation were not simply quirks, but the bedrock of my financial standing. By the end of the day, we had reached a tentative agreement. It wasn't a complete capitulation on my part, nor a total victory for Sarah. It was a compromise, a resolution forged in the crucible of negotiation. It acknowledged my contributions, secured my financial future, and provided Sarah with a fair, though perhaps not extravagant, settlement. As we stood to leave, Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with a complex mix of sadness and resignation. "Arthur," she began, her voice trembling, I'm sorry." I met her gaze, the anger long gone, replaced by a quiet acceptance. "I know, Sarah," I said. "We both made mistakes." The crossroads had been navigated. The path ahead was still uncertain, but the immediate crisis had been averted. The consequence of her words had been met, not with outright victory, but with a hard-won, realistic resolution. The ink had dried on the final settlement papers. The legal battles, the mediation sessions, the agonizing discussions. It was all over. The divorce was final, and Arthur, now a man of 60+, stood at the precipice of a future he had meticulously, and often painfully, engineered. The house, once the symbol of their shared life, was sold. The proceeds, divided according to the agreement, had been channeled into separate accounts, a tangible representation of their distinct paths. Arthur had kept the majority of his investment portfolios, the fruits of decades of diligent management, while Sarah received a settlement that, while substantial, was far less than her initial ambitious claims. He found himself in a new, smaller apartment in a quieter part of the city. It was a space designed for one, uncluttered and functional. The emptiness that initially felt stark now began to feel like a canvas, a blank slate upon which he could paint his own narrative, free from the suffocating comparisons and unspoken resentments that had defined his marriage. He reconnected with old friends, not the ones who orbited David's success, but those who valued genuine connection over superficial achievement. He joined a local hiking club, finding solace and a renewed sense of purpose in the rhythm of nature. He even started mentoring a young accountant at his firm, sharing the lessons he had learned, both professional and personal, over a lifetime. There were moments, of course, when the weight of the past would press down. He'd see a news report about David's latest triumph, or hear a snippet of conversation about Sarah's new life, and a flicker of the old hurt would surface. But it was no longer paralyzing. He had built his own foundation, one that was independent of external validation or comparison. One crisp autumn afternoon, as he sat on a park bench watching children play, he pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet. It was the one from their early years. Him, Sarah, and David, all young and hopeful. He looked at his own younger face, full of a different kind of ambition, a different kind of trust. He knew Sarah's words had been a catalyst, a harsh but ultimately liberating push. They had forced him to confront his own worth, to shed the skin of inadequacy, and to reclaim his narrative. He hadn't become twice the man, but he had become unequivocally himself. He thought about David, his old friend, still chasing the spotlight, still navigating the complexities of a life lived in the public eye. Arthur felt no envy, only a quiet understanding. Their paths had diverged, shaped by different choices, different values. The future stretched before him, unwritten and unpredictable. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic revelations, just the quiet dignity of a man who had weathered a storm, learned from its fury, and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably stronger. He had decided, in the face of his wife's dismissive words, that she wouldn't keep a dime of his hard-earned life, and in doing so, he had reclaimed something far more valuable, his own sense of self. The journey had been painful, the cost significant, but the ultimate reward, the freedom to live authentically, was immeasurable. He was Arthur, and his story was finally his own.